Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking on a stack of sources today that really get to the heart of something fundamental, how we navigate, they're the often choppy waters of our own feelings.
Absolutely. We're exploring the science behind emotional intelligence, focusing specifically on, well, those big three: anger, anxiety, and sadness. How do we handle these emotional storms, as the source calls them, and find some calm in all the chaos?
Right. And this deep dive is built just for you, the listener. You shared this fascinating material with us, asking for a kind of shortcut to understanding how to stay grounded when emotions feel overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
We've got insights here from psychology, neuroscience, even ancient philosophy, including bits discussing Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence.
So our mission really is to pull out the key insights. Why does managing emotions matter so much? What's the anatomy of these tough feelings? Any surprises about common coping methods?
And what strategies actually work.
Exactly. And we're sticking strictly to the sources you gave us. Okay, ready? Let's unpack this.
Okay, so the sources kick off with that classic quote from Hamlet,
Yeah.
about not being passion's slave. It really hits home that this struggle, being ruled by emotions, it's ancient, isn't it?
Oh, totally. The idea of self-mastery, especially over these emotional storms, it's been prized for ages. Plato called it sophrosyne, basically a care and intelligence in life, a kind of tempered balance.
Wisdom, yeah.
Yeah, and the Romans had temperantia, temperance, restraining that excess.
But it's not about becoming like a Vulcan, right?
Yeah.
The material seems really clear. The goal isn't suppression, it's balance.
And exactly, balance.
Yeah.
Every feeling, even the tough ones, they have value. A life without passion would be, well, pretty dull. The key, and this echoes Aristotle, is emotions being proportionate, fitting the situation.
Because if they're too muted, you get distance, detachment. But if they're out of control, too intense, or they just hang around too long, that's when they become pathological.
Immobilizing depression, overwhelming anxiety, rage, and keeping those distressing emotions in check. The sources present that as just fundamental to well-being. There are these studies mentioned using beepers to track moods.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and they suggest well-being isn't about never feeling bad. It's more about making sure the stormy feelings don't completely take over, pushing out all the good ones. It seems to be the ratio of positive to negative over time that really counts.
And interestingly, this emotional skill seems pretty separate from like book smarts or IQ.
Totally separate. And what's fascinating is how managing emotions is framed as almost a full-time job. A lot of what you do in your free time.
Reading, watching TV.
Choosing activities, who you hang out with. A lot of that can be seen as trying to manage your mood state, consciously or not.
That art of soothing ourselves. The material calls it a fundamental life skill. Cites thinkers like Bowlby and Winnicott, something ideally learned early on.
Makes you less vulnerable later. And while we often can't control when an emotion hits us or even what it is.
Right, it just washes over you.
Exactly. But the sources say we can have some say in how long it lasts. And that's where the strategies come in, especially when feelings get chronic or really extreme.
Okay, let's tackle the first big one then. Anger. There's that really vivid example in the material: someone cuts you off in traffic, that immediate flash, that jerk. Or worse.
Yes, and this is where it gets super interesting. The material explains how the path that rage takes depends hugely on what happens next, right after that first thought.
Does it just spiral?
Yeah. Do you follow it up with more thoughts, outrage, injustice, maybe revenge fantasies? If you do, your body goes into fight mode. Heart pounds, muscles tense, you feel that urge.
And then you're primed. So if someone else honks later, boom, you might explode at them. The sources link this pattern to serious stuff: hypertension, reckless driving.
Right, but contrast that with a different internal script like, maybe they didn't see me, or maybe it's an emergency. That possibility acts like a circuit breaker.
It cools it down.
Yeah, it tempers the anger short circuits that rage build up. Reminds me of Ben Franklin. Anger is never without a reason, but seldom a good one.
The material talks about the anatomy of rage. That first spark feels really primitive, right? Limbic system, amygdala reacting.
Danger signal.
But the more calculated anger, like holding a grudge or feeling outraged about injustice, that seems to involve the thinking brain, the neocortex, where we build the story about the anger.
Yeah, constructing those good reasons. And anger, it seems, is the mood that's hardest to let go of. Diane Tice's research found it's the one people feel least in control of.
Why is that?
Well, it's described as kind of seductive, that inner monologues, the self-righteousness. It feels really convincing, energizing even, which might explain why people think it's uncontrollable or that venting is somehow good for you.
But the research says those are myths. Venting doesn't actually help.
Generally, no. The key to diffusing anger, according to the work of Dolph Zillman discussed here, is tackling the thoughts that fuel it. Brooding just feeds the fire.
Makes sense.
Seeing things differently, reframing, that's what douses the flames. Tice found reframing was incredibly powerful.
And Zillman's experiments found that feeling endangered physically or symbolically, like an insult, that's a universal trigger.
Yep. Universal trigger. You get that first rush of stress hormones, catecholamines for quick fight or flight, last minutes. But then that triggers a longer readiness state, adrenocortical readiness, hours, even days.
Ah, so that's the hair trigger condition.
Exactly. If you're already stressed or irritated from something earlier, you're way more likely to blow up later over something minor, like that example of the mom. Initial frustration, then the baby drops the jar, boom. Stress lowers the anger threshold.
So anger builds on anger. Zillman sees it like a chain reaction. Each annoying thought, each little provocation.
It's like a mini trigger, riding the wave of the hormones already there. By the time full rage hits, reason is basically offline. People are fixated on revenge, blind to consequences.
Okay, so how do you intervene? Zillman points to two main ways.
Yeah, two main strategies. First, challenge the thoughts. Catch that initial appraisal early. Look for mitigating info like maybe the rude cashier is having a terrible day, but this works best at like moderate anger levels.
Because when you're seeing red,
forget it. People can no longer think straight, as the source puts it. You just dismiss anything that contradicts the rage.
so what's the second strategy?
Physiological cooling down. You basically have to wait out the hormone surge, get away from the trigger, find a distraction-rich place, get some distance.
There's that old story from 1899.
Yeah.
The kid walking in nature to cool off.
Right. And Tice's modern research backs up similar things. Getting away alone guys often drive, apparently. Exercise, relaxation techniques, deep breathing, muscle relaxation.
Or distraction. TV, reading, games.
Yeah, distraction works because it breaks that angry thought cycle. Hard to stay furious if you're genuinely engaged in something else. But just like eating ice cream while still fuming inside, not so effective.
And that work with hostile people. Redford Williams emphasizes self-awareness, catching those cynical thoughts.
Catching them, writing them down, challenging them. Again, better before full rage hits.
And venting, definitely not the answer.
The material calls it the ventilation fallacy. Research since the 50s shows it mostly just amps you up, makes the anger last longer, even if it feels good for a second.
So much better to cool down first. Let the physical storm pass. Then maybe deal with the situation assertively, calmly. Love that Tibetan teacher quote. Don't suppress it, but don't act on it.
Okay, let's shift gears. Anxiety. Especially that feeling of endless worry. The source uses that example. The car muffler sound turning into worries about college tuition. It's so relatable.
Totally. Worry is described as the heart of anxiety, right?
Right.
Sometimes it's useful, constructive thinking, problem solving. Evolutionarily, it's about vigilance.
Right. Rehearsing what might go wrong, how you'd cope, preparing for danger.
But the problem is chronic worry, repetitive, that low-grade emotional hijack the source talks about. Feels uncontrollable, reason doesn't touch it, your mind just gets stuck.
And when it gets really intense and persistent, it becomes anxiety disorders, phobias, OCD, panic attacks, where the worry just fixates intensely.
Those examples are powerful. The person constantly washing, fearing germs, or the worrier just catastrophizing everything, worrying about worrying. And the key finding worries are usually verbal, in your head, not pictures.
Yeah, in the mind's ear. That distinction turns out to be important. Jim Borkowicz's research, which started by looking at insomnia.
Right. He found it wasn't just physical restlessness.
No, it was the intrusive thoughts, the worries keeping people awake. And getting their minds off the worries, like focusing on relaxation sensations, actually helped them sleep. Shifting attention breaks the loop.
But chronic worriers feel like they can't just stop. The source says there's a kind of hidden payoff. That reinforces the habit.
This is really fascinating. Borkowicz's suggests two reasons people get stuck, even though the worry feels awful and doesn't solve anything. First, a kind of magical thinking.
Magical thinking.
Yeah. Because lots of feared things are low probability anyway, the primitive brain kind of gives the worry credit for preventing the bad thing from happening, like wearing a lucky charm.
Ah, okay. Because the disaster didn't happen, the worry feels like it worked.
Sort of. And the second reason is a form of anxiety suppression. By focusing hard on the worried thoughts, the verbal stuff, people don't fully tune into the physical feelings of anxiety, the racing heart, the sweating, that the underlying catastrophic images would trigger more strongly.
So the thoughts are bad, but less physiologically activating than the images they represent.
Exactly. The thoughts become a sort of halfway antidote to the deeper anxiety the worry itself evokes. It gets reinforced because it feels like it's doing something, managing the feeling a little, even though it's rigid and solves nothing.
Which explains why just stop worrying is useless advice for chronic worriers. These are persistent, low-grade amygdala things.
Right. But Borkovik's work did find steps that help. First, self-awareness. Learning to notice the worry starting. Identifying your triggers, situations, thoughts, physical feelings. Practice makes you catch it earlier.
Okay, notice it. Then what?
Second, relaxation. Learn and practice relaxation daily, so you have a tool ready to counter the physical anxiety signals on the spot. Create a state incompatible with anxiety.
Makes sense.
And third,
Challenge the thoughts. Actively question the assumptions behind the worry. How likely is this really? Are there other possibilities? Is this thought actually helping me solve anything?
so mindfulness plus skepticism.
Basically, yeah. It acts like a brake on the neural stuff driving the anxiety. Challenging the thought stops you from just accepting it as true. It creates a different mental track.
And for really severe anxiety disorders.
Medication might be needed initially to break that intense cycle, but therapy, retraining these emotional circuits, is still seen as key for long-term change and preventing relapse.
Okay, final big one. Sadness. Melancholy. The sources say this is the mood people put the most effort into shaking off. Yeah, according to Tice's research. And like the others, sadness has its uses. The sadness after a loss. It forces a kind of retreat. Time to grieve, process, adjust, plan. Bereavement is functional.
But full-blown depression isn't. That William Styron description in the material, chilling. The self-hatred, confusion, physical symptoms, loss of pleasure, vanishing hope.
Yeah, that's a state of paralysis. Needs professional help, therapy, medication, or both. Our focus here, though, based on the sources, is more that ordinary melancholy. Subclinical sadness people can potentially manage themselves.
But some common strategies backfire, like being alone.
Right. It feels appealing when you're down, but often just makes the loneliness worse, deepens the sadness.
Tice found socializing is popular, but only works if it's actually distracting.
Exactly. If you just sit there mulling over your problems with other people, it doesn't help lift the mood.
Which points to that key factor again. Rumination. Dwelling on it.
Mm-hmm. Susan Nolan-Hoeksma's research really highlights this. Worrying about what's depressing you, focusing on symptoms like tiredness or negative thoughts like, I'm a failure, makes the depression more intense and lasts longer. It doesn't lead to action.
People might think they're understanding themselves.
Right, but the material suggests it just keeps activating the sadness circuits without actually improving anything. Passive immersion makes it worse. It strengthens negative associations too, like that saleswoman example. Worrying about her mood, fewer sales confirms I'm a failure. Vicious cycle.
The source notes women tend to ruminate more than men. Might partly explain higher depression rates in women, while men might turn to other things, like alcohol.
That's suggested as one possible factor, yeah. And those other coping mechanisms, like substance use, obviously carry huge risks too.
So cognitive therapy targeting those thought patterns seems effective.
Yes. As effective as meds for mild depression, apparently, and maybe better at preventing relapse. Two main strategies come up again. Challenging the depressing thoughts and scheduling pleasant, distracting events.
Distraction again. Why is that so key for sadness, too?
Because depressive thoughts can feel so automatic, tied to strong negative links in the brain. It's hard to just suppress them. Richard Wenslaf's studies showed depressed people were actually better at unscrambling sad sentences.
Right.
And when trying to distract themselves from something sad, they tended to pick other sad things, or their mind just drifted back.
So you have to consciously choose upbeat distractions.
Yes. An exciting game, a genuinely funny movie, an uplifting book. Be careful not to pick a tearjerker. And interestingly, just passively watching a lot of TV was linked to feeling more depressed afterwards.
What about physical stuff? Exercise.
Aerobic exercise gets a strong mention. Particularly effective for mild depression, especially if you're not usually active. It changes your physical state from low arousal depression to higher arousal energy, incompatible with sadness. Relaxation, which lowers arousal, isn't as helpful for depression as it is for anxiety.
Other tactics mentioned. Small wins, like doing chores, looking after your appearance, treats.
Yeah, engineering small successes. Lifts to self-image, simple pleasures, baths, food, music, shopping. Though again, caution about excesses like binge eating or drinking.
And 2 really potent antidotes highlighted.
Right. 1, cognitive reframing, seeing things differently. Instead of just feeling awful after a breakup, think about the relationship's downsides. Or comparing yourself downward, well, at least I don't have that problem. Surprisingly effective sometimes.
Okay. And the second?
Helping others. Shifts focus off yourself. Volunteering came out as one of the most powerful mood lifters in Tice's study, though also one people rarely used.
Interesting. And finally, turning to faith or prayer for some people.
Mentioned as helpful, especially for the very religious.
Okay, the material wraps up with this really curious group. Repressors, or maybe better, unflappables. People who seem to just block out bad feelings.
Yeah, that sentence completion example is wild. He kicked his roommate, but he meant to turn on the light, like instantly glossing over the disturbing part.
They seem incredibly calm, imperturbable. You might think they just don't feel things deeply. But the current idea is they're actually just really, really good at regulating. So good they aren't even aware of the negative stuff bubbling under.
That seems to be the thinking. But Daniel Weinberger's research threw a curveball. Their outward calm didn't match what was happening inside.
How so?
During those stressful tasks, even while saying they felt fine, their bodies were showing anxiety, heart racing, sweating, blood pressure climbing.
Wow. And about 1 in 6 people show this pattern. Maybe learned in families where problems were denied.
Possible origins mentioned, yeah. But by adulthood, they seemed genuinely cool under pressure on the surface.
And Richard Davidson's brain research gave a clue how this might work. Something about communication between brain hemispheres.
Yeah, really clever stuff. Using visuals shown to only one side of the brain, he found these unflappable folks had a delay responding to upsetting words processed by the right hemisphere linked to negative feelings, but no delay on the left.
Suggesting some kind of neural buffer, slowing down the bad news from reaching conscious awareness.
Kind of like the brain is keeping the I'm upset information from them. It's not conscious faking. It seems to be happening automatically, neurologically.
And Davidson also found they have more activity in the left prefrontal area linked to good feelings even at rest.
And less on the right. His theory is that actively maintaining positivity or suppressing negativity takes work. It's metabolically demanding. And that effort might cause the underlying physical arousal Weinberger saw.
So, unflappability. It's like an upbeat denial. A positive dissociation.
That's how the source frames it, yeah. It concludes, it seems like a pretty successful strategy for emotional self-regulation, keeps them feeling calm, but maybe at some unknown cost to deeper self-awareness.
Wow, okay. From Plato and Aristotle to modern brain scans, this deep dive really underscores that managing our emotional world isn't just, a nice to have, it's fundamental.
Absolutely fundamental to well-being. We've seen how anger can escalate through our thoughts, how worry traps us, how sadness feeds on itself through rumination.
But crucially, the sources offer real tools. The power of reframing, strategic upbeat distraction, changing your physical state with exercise, helping others.
Yeah, and the understanding that sometimes needing professional help isn't weakness, it's actually a sign of self-awareness.
It really makes you reflect on your own patterns, doesn't it? When anger or anxiety or sadness hits, do you tend to ruminate or distract? Do your distractions actually lift you up or drag you down? Are you even aware of the first physical signs?
And maybe the most provocative thought to leave with, how much of this regulation might be happening totally outside our awareness, like the unflappables? What are the hidden costs or maybe even benefits of our minds working behind the scenes to keep us steady, sometimes without us even knowing the effort involved?
That is definitely plenty to chew on. Thanks for sharing all this material with us for the deep dive.
Always a pleasure. Until next time.